My name is Madison Carter. I am 32 years old. That night, the dinner table turned into a courtroom. My father slid papers toward me, declaring my sister would take control of nearly half my business. But when I pulled out my own folder, the silence was deafening. Before I tell you how everything flipped, like and subscribe, drop a comment where you are watching from. To understand the silence in that dining room, you have to understand the noise of my childhood. It wasn't a loud, chaotic noise. It was the constant, humming noise of favoritism, a background frequency that tuned my entire existence. Growing up, my world felt like it was built on a tilt. My younger sister, Danielle, lived at the top of the slope, bathed in sunlight, while I learned to find my footing on the unsteady ground below, perpetually in her shadow. From the moment she could walk, she wasn't just my father's daughter. She was his masterpiece. Charles Carter, my father, didn't just love her. He worshipped her. It wasn't a secret. It wasn't subtle. It was a visible, tangible force that shaped every birthday, every holiday, every school report card, and every quiet dinner of my life. Danielle was the golden child, a title she wore as effortlessly as the designer clothes Dad bought her. Her childhood was a highlight reel of special treatment. When she showed a fleeting interest in ballet at age 6, my father enrolled her in the most prestigious dance academy in the city. Her closet was a testament to his affection, overflowing with dresses from expensive boutiques, each one presented to her with a flourish. I remember watching her twirl in a new velvet dress before a holiday party, the fabric catching the light. My father's eyes would shine with a kind of adoration I never saw directed at me. "My talented girl," he'd say, his voice thick with pride. "Look at her, just like a princess." I would be standing nearby in a dress from a department store, presentable but plain, a silent attendant to the princess. My presence was acknowledged with a quick nod, a perfunctory, "You look nice too, Madison." It was the "too" that always stung, the afterthought that defined my position. The disparity was everywhere. Our birthday parties were a perfect example. For Danielle's 8th birthday, our backyard was transformed into a carnival. There was a bouncy castle, a hired clown, a cotton candy machine, and a mountain of professionally wrapped presents. Dozens of her friends ran screaming with delight across the lawn. My 8th birthday, just a few months earlier, had been a quiet affair in the living room with a homemade cake and 2 of my friends. When I'd asked why Danielle's was so much bigger, my stepmother, Evelyn, had smoothed down my hair with a placating smile. "Your sister is just more social, dear. She has so many friends who adore her." The implication was clear. I was not as adored. Therefore, I was not worth the same celebration. Evelyn had married my father when I was 12, and she slid into the family dynamic as if she were born for the role of Queen Regent to Princess Danielle. She had no children of her own and latched onto my sister, amplifying my father's favoritism until it was an impenetrable wall. She was the one who would inspect my report cards, covered in A's, and say, "That's wonderful, Madison. It's so important to have a good work ethic." Then she would see Danielle's report card, a mix of B's and C's, and gush, "Oh, Danielle, you're so wonderfully well-rounded. You don't let schoolwork get in the way of living your life." My achievements were a work ethic. Her mediocrity was a well-rounded life. This narrative followed me into high school and beyond. When I made the varsity soccer team, my father attended one game, stood on the sidelines looking at his watch, and left at halftime. When Danielle was cast as the 3rd tree from the left in the school play, he and Evelyn bought a bouquet of roses and took the entire family out for a celebratory dinner afterward. At that dinner, he toasted our little star, and Danielle soaked in the attention. I sat there, my shins bruised from a game-winning slide tackle, and felt completely invisible. Then came college. For Danielle, it was a foregone conclusion. The only question was which prestigious out-of-state university she would grace with her presence. The tuition was astronomical, but my father didn't blink. He spoke of it as an investment in her future, a future he had already mapped out for her. He hired consultants to help with her application essays and bragged to his friends about her acceptance letters. The day he wrote the first tuition check, he did so with a proud smile, as if it were a privilege. For me, college was a mountain I had to climb alone. There was no tuition check. There was no discussion of investments. There was only the constant refrain, "You're so independent, Madison." He said it like a compliment, but it felt like an abdication of responsibility. It was his excuse to not provide for me the way he provided for Danielle. So I worked. I took the night shift at a 24-hour diner, the smell of grease and burnt coffee clinging to my clothes. I balanced trays and mopped floors, my mind replaying lectures on macroeconomics. I moved on to a job at a bookstore, the quiet hours spent shelving books and studying in a back corner. I took on freelance data entry, my eyes burning from staring at a screen until 3 a.m. My textbooks were always secondhand, filled with the highlights and notes of strangers. My clothes were from thrift stores. My meals often consisted of instant noodles. I was exhausted, perpetually stressed, but I was doing it. I was earning my degree, dollar by painful dollar. My independence wasn't a choice. It was a necessity. And yet, it was consistently framed as a character flaw. "You're just so selfish for wanting to do everything on your own," Evelyn would say during my rare visits home. "Your father would help if you'd just let him." But I knew what their help meant. It meant control. It meant being indebted to them, giving them leverage. I remembered asking my dad for a small loan for a required chemistry lab kit my freshman year. He'd sighed heavily. "Madison, when are you going to learn to stand on your own 2 feet?" Danielle would never ask for a handout. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. Danielle wasn't asking for handouts. She was receiving a full-body lift, carried through life on my father's shoulders. The feeling of being othered was a constant companion, a ghost that sat beside me in every lecture hall and every late-night study session. It whispered to me that my struggle was my own fault, a consequence of my difficult, independent nature. Family gatherings were exercises in self-erasure. The conversation always revolved around Danielle's sorority, her glamorous friends, her spring break trip to Cancun, funded by Dad. When I tried to share something about a professor who had praised my thesis, or a small academic award I'd won, the subject would be politely acknowledged and then immediately steered back to Danielle. "That's nice, dear," Evelyn would say, patting my hand in a gesture that felt more like a dismissal than an affirmation. The family photos from that era tell the whole story. Danielle always in the center, wrapped in my father's arm, her smile wide and camera-ready. I was an accessory on the edge of the frame, often slightly out of focus, a satellite in orbit around their perfect family sun. I learned to minimize myself, to expect less, to fade into the wallpaper. The hurt was a dull, constant ache in my chest. It made me question my worth, my place in the world. But deep beneath the hurt, a different feeling began to take root. It was a cold, quiet resolve. It was the understanding that if I wanted anything in this life, I would have to build it myself, far away from their tilted world. If no one else was going to look out for me, I would become my own fiercest protector. And that resolve, forged in the fires of their casual neglect, would become the foundation for everything that came next. The quiet resolve I cultivated in college became the engine of my life. After graduating, with a degree I had fought tooth and nail for, I refused to take the easy path. I didn't apply for a safe corporate job where I could be a cog in someone else's machine. I had a vision, an idea that had sparked during my lonely late-night study sessions. I wanted to create a space, a community, where artists, the other outsiders, the ones with unique visions, could connect directly with people who would appreciate their work. I wanted to build a bridge between creation and appreciation, and I wanted to do it on my own terms. Thus, Artistry Link was born. It began in the cramped corner of my tiny one-bedroom apartment. My first office was a second-hand desk shoved against a window that overlooked a brick wall. My initial capital wasn't a gift or an investment from family. It was the sum total of my meager savings from my college jobs, combined with a small high-interest loan from a credit union that I secured without a cosigner. I didn't tell my family. I knew with absolute certainty that they would have smothered the idea before it could draw its first breath. My father would have called it a frivolous hobby, and Evelyn would have warned me about the dangers of being an unreliable artist type. Their disapproval was a given, so I chose silence. I chose to build in the dark. Those first few years were a brutal, relentless grind. I was the CEO, the marketing department, the web developer, the customer service representative, and the janitor. I worked 18-hour days, fueled by cheap coffee and a burning desire to prove something, not just to them, but to myself. I taught myself basic coding from online tutorials, my screen glowing in the dark as I struggled with lines of code until dawn. I cold-called artists, my voice shaking at first, trying to convince them to trust my fledgling platform. I packed and shipped the first orders myself, wrapping each piece with care, writing personal thank you notes to every buyer. There were so many moments of doubt. I remember one night, about a year in, when a server crash wiped out a week's worth of data. I sat on my floor, surrounded by takeout containers, and cried. I was exhausted, broke, and felt utterly alone. The temptation to call my father, to admit defeat, was immense. But then I pictured his face, not with sympathy, but with a kind of knowing pity, a look that would say, "I told you so." That image was enough to make me stand up, wipe my tears, and spend the next 72 hours straight rebuilding the site from scratch. Slowly, painstakingly, the hard work began to pay off. The first real victory was a well-known ceramicist who agreed to feature her collection exclusively on Artistry Link. Her followers flocked to the site, and sales surged. That small success created a ripple effect. More artists joined, attracted by the favorable terms and the sense of community I was fostering. The platform gained traction. I hired my first employee, a bright young graduate named Sarah who shared my passion. We moved out of my apartment and into a small sunlit office space. The feeling of unlocking the door to a place that was truly mine, a place I had built from nothing, was a feeling I will never forget. Artistry Link was featured in a popular design blog, then an online business journal. We were praised for our innovative model and our commitment to supporting independent artists. The company was growing, becoming something real, something respected. I was finally, truly independent. And that's when my family decided to get involved. The escalation was insidious. It began with my father taking unearned credit in his social circles. I'd run into one of his golf buddies at a coffee shop, and he'd clap me on the shoulder. "Charles was just telling us about how he set you up with his venture capital contacts to get that business of yours off the ground. Smart man, your father." I would just smile weakly, my stomach twisting into a knot. "What contacts?" He hadn't lifted a finger. He hadn't made a single call. But in his retelling, my years of solitary struggle were erased, replaced by a narrative in which he was the benevolent patriarch, the silent partner behind my success. He was retroactively inserting himself into a story from which he had been completely absent. Then came Danielle's demands. Her entitlement, always simmering, boiled over in direct proportion to my success. After graduating, she drifted through life, supported by a steady allowance from Dad. She tried being a social media influencer, then a jewelry designer, then a lifestyle blogger, abandoning each pursuit as soon as it required actual effort. One afternoon, she called me, her voice breezy and entitled. "Maddie, I have the most amazing news," she chirped. "I've decided I need a new car. A Range Rover, white." "That's nice, Danielle," I said, confused. "Are you looking for a job to save up for it?" She laughed, a high tinkling sound that grated on my nerves. "Don't be silly. You're going to buy it for me. It's only fair. Think of it as a family investment. I'll look so good driving it. It will be great for your brand image." I was speechless. She wasn't asking. She was informing me of a decision she had made about my money. I tried to explain that a $60,000 car was not something I could just buy. I had employees to pay, overhead, taxes. "Danielle, that's not how it works," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "The company's success means I have to reinvest, not go on personal shopping sprees." Her response was cold and sharp. "Dad said you were being selfish. He said you're hoarding money and forgetting about the people who got you where you are." Again, that false narrative. They saw my company not as my achievement, but as a collective family resource that I was unfairly managing. Holiday dinners transformed from emotionally draining obligations into full-blown financial ambushes. The elegant dining room became a boardroom where I was the sole target. One Thanksgiving, my father laid out architectural plans for a massive renovation of their summer lake house. "We're thinking a new deck, a gourmet kitchen. And Madison, we were hoping you'd be the primary investor for this project. Think of the wonderful family memories we'll create." He said it with a magnanimous smile, as if offering me a golden opportunity. He wasn't asking for a loan, he was assigning me a bill. I tried to refuse politely but firmly. "Dad, I can't. The business needs every spare dollar right now for expansion." His face darkened instantly. The jovial host vanished, replaced by a cold, angry patriarch. "Ungrateful," he spat, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "After everything we've done for you." Evelyn, sitting beside him, patted his arm. "Family helps family, Madison," she said, her voice laced with disappointment. "It's not a negotiation." Their definition of family helping family was a one-way street, paved with my money and leading directly to their desires. The psychological toll was immense. I began to dread the sound of my phone ringing. Every text from Danielle started with a demand. Every email from my father's assistant was a veiled request for funds. They tried to position me as the family matriarch in financial terms, while still treating me like the disobedient child in emotional terms. I was supposed to be the responsible provider, yet I was given none of the respect or autonomy that should have come with it. The final straw before the disastrous dinner was a conversation with Danielle about her latest failed venture. She had spent $10,000, a loan from me that my father had pressured me into giving, on supplies for a custom candle-making business. She'd gotten bored after 2 weeks. When I asked about the money, she scoffed. "Oh, that? That was seed money. Most startups fail. You should know that." She treated my hard-earned cash like play money, a consequence-free resource to fund her whims. It was then that I realized they would never stop. Their appetite for my success was insatiable. They wouldn't be content with small bites. They wanted to devour the whole thing. The pressure was building, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that a confrontation was inevitable. They were coming for my company. I just didn't realize how soon, or how brutally, they would make their move. The atmosphere in my father's marble-floored dining room always felt performative, like a stage set for a play about a wealthy, happy family. The heavy damask curtains were always drawn, shutting out the real world and creating a bubble of opulent isolation. The long mahogany table was always polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the cold light of the crystal chandelier above. It was a beautiful room, but it was not a warm one. It was a room for announcements and judgments, not for connection. On this particular night, the chill in the air had nothing to do with the temperature. It was a deliberate, suffocating coldness, and it was directed entirely at me. I had been summoned under the guise of a family strategy dinner. The phrase itself was a red flag. But I had come anyway, clinging to a foolish, stubborn sliver of hope that maybe, this time, they wanted my actual input. Maybe they finally saw me as a peer. But the moment I walked in, I knew I was wrong. The air was thick with a conspiratorial tension. Danielle was perched on her chair, looking impossibly smug, her wine glass held aloft like a trophy. Evelyn was a picture of serene, predatory calm. And my father, Charles, sat at the head of the table, not as a father, but as a chairman of the board, a stack of professionally bound legal documents placed squarely beside his plate. His posture was rigid, his expression unreadable but severe. This was not a dinner. It was an ambush. We ate the main course in near silence. The only sounds were the discreet clinking of silverware against porcelain, and the occasional stilted pleasantry lobbed across the table like a grenade. I barely tasted the food, some kind of roasted duck with a cherry reduction that felt absurdly decadent for the occasion. My stomach was a tight knot of dread. I could feel their eyes on me, watching me, waiting. It felt like they were savoring the moment before the kill. As soon as the plates were cleared, my father placed his hands flat on the table, a gesture of finality. He cleared his throat, a sound that cut through the silence and signaled the beginning of the proceedings. "Madison," he began, his voice devoid of any warmth. It was the same tone he used with underlings in his business, a tone of command, not conversation. "We need to have a serious discussion about the future of Artistry Link." My heart, which had been hammering against my ribs, gave a painful lurch. This was it. He didn't wait for a response. He picked up the stack of documents and shoved them across the polished table. The papers slid with a soft, sinister hiss, a sound that seemed to echo in the cavernous room. They stopped just inches from my water glass. I stared at the cover page. The bold black letters seemed to mock me. "Transfer of business interest and corporate restructuring agreement." "You will sign these," he commanded. It wasn't a request. It was an order. His eyes, cold and gray like steel, were locked on mine. "Danielle is going to be taking a more active role. She will be assuming a 40% ownership stake in the company, effective immediately." The words hit me like a physical blow. 40%. It was an astronomical number, a figure so audacious it stole the air from my lungs. 40% of my creation, my struggle, my identity. I had poured my soul into Artistry Link, and he was ordering me to carve out nearly half of it and hand it to Danielle on a silver platter. Danielle, whose only contribution had been to demand its profits. Danielle, who thought equity was something you built in a house, not a company. I couldn't stop myself from looking at her. The smirk I had seen earlier had blossomed into a full-blown smile of undisguised triumph. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her wine, her eyes dancing with malicious delight as she watched me absorb the blow. This was what she had always wanted. My life, my success, handed to her without any of the work. And she was relishing my pain, my humiliation. This was her victory lap. Evelyn, ever the supportive accomplice, leaned forward, her voice a low, syrupy whisper that was somehow more venomous than my father's blunt command. "This is for the best, Madison. It's for the sake of family stability. You've been under so much stress, running that company all by yourself. It's time you had some help. It's time to bring it back into the family fold. Family stability?" I finally managed to say, my voice a strangled whisper. It felt thin and weak in the heavy silence. "This isn't about stability. This is about you taking what I built." My father's jaw clenched. A muscle ticked in his cheek. Do not be dramatic, Madison. This is about what is fair. This family has given you every advantage, and it's time you gave something back. Danielle deserves a secure future. You have more than enough to share. More than enough. The phrase was a dagger. I had more than enough because I had worked for it, sacrificed for it, bled for it. They had less than they wanted because they had squandered their own opportunities, living off past glories and future expectations. The injustice of it was a physical sensation, a burning fire in my gut. I felt utterly and completely cornered. The opulent room, designed to project an image of power and success, now felt like a gilded cage. The three of them were a united front, a tribunal that had already reached its verdict. I was the defendant, the guilty party, and my sentence was to be stripped of my life's work. The humiliation was a hot flush that crept up my neck and burned my cheeks. They weren't just taking my company, they were trying to take my dignity. They were putting me back in my place as the family resource, the designated provider, the quiet, obedient daughter who existed to serve their needs. My hands, resting in my lap, trembled. I wanted to scream, to throw the documents in his face, to run out of that house and never look back. But I was paralyzed, frozen by the sheer, breathtaking audacity of their betrayal. This wasn't just a greedy request for money. This was a planned, calculated, legal maneuver to seize control of my life. They had hired lawyers. They had drafted contracts. They had plotted this behind my back, all while smiling to my face at family functions. My father sat back in his chair, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. He was watching me, waiting for the inevitable collapse. He expected me to crumble, to dissolve into tears and sign the papers just to make the agony stop. Evelyn's eyes were sharp and assessing, watching for any sign of weakness she could exploit. Danielle looked bored, as if the outcome was so certain that the process was becoming tiresome. They thought they had me. They thought I was beaten. In that moment, every memory of being overlooked, every dismissive comment, every unacknowledged achievement, every demand for money, it all coalesced into a single, unbearable point of pressure. They had spent my entire life making me feel small, and now they were trying to make my accomplishments small, to reduce my entire life's work to a bargaining chip for their own comfort. The pain of it was immense, a deep, crushing weight. But as I sat there, pinned by their collective gaze, something inside me shifted. The pain began to cool, to harden. It solidified from a molten agony into something else entirely. It became a cold, sharp, unbending core of resolve. They had pushed me too far. They had underestimated me one last time. They thought this was my breaking point. They were about to discover it was theirs. The silence in the dining room stretched, thick and heavy with their victory. My father's command to sign the papers hung in the air, a final, non-negotiable decree. He watched me, his face a mask of stern authority, fully expecting my compliance. Danielle swirled the wine in her glass, a picture of smug entitlement, while Evelyn maintained a look of pious, concerned justification. They were waiting for the finale of their carefully staged play, the moment the victim finally breaks and accepts her fate. My trembling hands, the hot tears I could feel welling behind my eyes. It was all going according to their script, but as I sat there, feeling the full weight of their betrayal, a strange and unexpected clarity washed over me. It was like a sudden calm in the eye of a hurricane. The roaring emotions, the hurt, the anger, the humiliation, receded, and in their place was a quiet, icy stillness. This moment, I realized, was not an ending. It was a beginning. It was the culmination of every slight, every dismissal, every time I had been made to feel less than. And it was the moment I would stop accepting it. The girl who cried in her dorm room over their neglect was gone. The woman who bit her tongue while they demanded her hard-earned money was gone. In their place was someone they had never met. Someone they had, in fact, created. Instead of reaching for the pen lying beside their predatory documents, I lowered my hands from the table. My movements were slow, deliberate. I broke eye contact with my father and looked down at the large black leather bag I had placed on the floor beside my chair. The simple act of looking away from them was a small rebellion, and I felt a flicker of power in it. The click of my bag's metal clasp opening was a sharp, distinct sound in the silent room. It drew their attention. I saw my father's brow furrow in confusion. This was not part of his plan. I reached inside, and my fingers closed around the cool, smooth spine of a file folder. It was a simple black folder, almost identical to the one they had pushed at me, but this one held my truth, not their fiction. I pulled it out and placed it on the table with a soft, definitive thud. The sound seemed to resonate, a counterpoint to their demands. I didn't open it. I just slid it across the polished mahogany, a mirror image of my father's earlier action. It stopped a few inches from his hand, Page 9, I said. My voice was completely changed. The thin, reedy whisper was gone. In its place was a voice that was low, calm, and unshakable. It held no anger, no pleading. It held only fact. A flicker of annoyance crossed my father's face. He clearly thought this was some desperate, amateurish bluff. He probably imagined I had brought bank statements to prove my company's finances or some other irrelevant piece of paper. With a sigh of theatrical impatience, he picked up my folder and flipped it open. He scanned the first few pages with a dismissive air, his expression conveying that he was humoring my little delay tactic. Then his eyes found page 9. The transformation was immediate and absolute. It was as if a switch had been flipped, plunging his entire being into darkness. The color drained from his face, leaving behind a waxy grayish pallor. His arrogant posture collapsed, his shoulders slumping as if under an immense invisible weight. His jaw went slack, his mouth hanging slightly open. The cold authority in his eyes vanished, replaced by a dawning, horrified disbelief. And beneath that, something I had never seen in him before, genuine fear. He was staring at a clause in a contract he had signed 2 years ago, a contract I had kept locked in a safe, a trump card I had prayed I would never have to play. The memory of that time came rushing back to me with perfect clarity. It hadn't been in this grand, imposing dining room. It had been in a sterile, anonymous coffee shop downtown, late on a Tuesday night. My father had called me, his voice strained, desperate. His latest high-risk real estate venture had imploded spectacularly. He was on the verge of bankruptcy, facing not just financial ruin but public humiliation. The bank was threatening to foreclose on his properties, including the house we were now sitting in. He was broken. The powerful patriarch was gone, replaced by a terrified man begging his forgotten daughter for help. He needed money, a lot of it, and he needed it quietly. He couldn't go to his friends or business partners without his world of carefully constructed success shattering. So he came to me. He promised he would pay me back with interest. He swore it was just a temporary setback. A part of me, the part that still yearned for a father's love, wanted to just write the check. But the other part of me, the part that had been forged in his neglect, knew better. I called my lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Ms. Albright. "Protect yourself, Madison," she had warned me. "Hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. Sentiment has no place in a contract." So, we drafted the agreement. It was a bailout, a substantial loan that would save his company and his home. And buried within the dense legalese on page 9 was the collateral clause. It stipulated that if the loan was not repaid within a specified time frame, or if any attempt was made to seize control or assets from my own company, Artistry Link, then majority voting control of my company would legally and irrevocably transfer to me, solidifying my position beyond any doubt. It was a defensive measure, designed to prevent the very thing he was trying to do tonight. He had been so frantic, so desperate to get the money, that he had signed it without a second thought, barely skimming the pages his daughter had put in front of him. I had quietly had it notarized, filed, and put it away. Back in the dining room, the present slammed back into focus. My father's hand, which had been holding the folder, trembled. His fork, which he had placed on the edge of his plate, slipped from its precarious perch. It clattered onto the marble floor, the sharp, metallic sound echoing in the profound, deathly silence. It was the sound of his power shattering. He finally lifted his head, his eyes wide and vacant, and stared at me. He was looking at me, his daughter, but it was as if he was seeing a stranger. The obedient, emotional girl he thought he could control and manipulate was gone. In her place was a strategist, a woman who had outplayed him at his own game, using the rules he himself had taught her. Never sign anything without reading the fine print. Danielle, seeing the look on our father's face, finally understood that something was terribly wrong. Her smug expression dissolved into a mask of confused panic. "Dad, what is it? What's on that paper?" she asked, her voice high and uncertain. Evelyn leaned forward, her eyes darting between my father's ashen face and the document in his hand. "Charles, what is this nonsense?" My father didn't answer them. He couldn't seem to speak. He just kept staring at me, the silence stretching on, thick with the weight of his stunning, total defeat. The trap he had so carefully laid for me had snapped shut on him instead. And in that deafening silence, I felt the tilted world of my childhood finally, blessedly, begin to right itself. Of course, here is the completion of Madison Carter's story, picking up immediately after the breaking point and carrying through to the resolution. The woman who sat at that dinner table, calm and armed with a black folder, was not born in that moment. She was forged over the preceding 6 months, in the quiet solitude of her apartment and the sterile anonymity of her lawyer's office. My breaking point had not been the documents my father shoved at me. It had been a seemingly insignificant phone call half a year earlier. It was a Tuesday morning, and I was in the middle of a crucial meeting with my development team. My phone buzzed, and it was Danielle. I ignored it, but she called again and again. Fearing an emergency, I excused myself and answered, "What's wrong?" I asked, my heart pounding. "Oh my God, Maddie, it's a total disaster," she wailed. "The clutch on my BMW is acting up, and the dealership says it's going to be like $2,000 to fix. Can you believe it? You have to handle it. Just call them and give them your credit card." I stood there, in the hallway of the company I had built from nothing, and listened to my sister have a meltdown over a car repair, a car I had been pressured into buying for her in the first place. There was no please, no thank you, just a demand, an expectation. I wasn't her sister, I was her personal concierge and bank. In that moment, something inside me didn't just break, it vaporized. The foolish hope I had clung to for years, the hope that one day they would see me, respect me, love me for who I was and not what I could provide, vanished. It left behind a cold, hard vacuum. I told her I would see what I could do and hung up. I didn't call the dealership. I called my lawyer, Ms. Albright. "They're going to come for the company," I told her, my voice flat. "It's not a matter of if, but when. I need to be ready." And so my silent preparation began. While they continued their lives of oblivious entitlement, I began to build my fortress. Ms. Albright was methodical, a woman whose calm demeanor masked a mind like a steel trap. "Power isn't taken, Madison," she told me during our first strategy session. "It is solidified. You already have the power. We just need to make it legally unassailable." Our first step was a deep dive into the company's history and my own financial records. For weeks, I spent my evenings not relaxing or going out with friends, but hunched over boxes of old bank statements, receipts, and email chains. It was a painful archaeological dig into my own history of exploitation. Each document was a fresh cut. There was the scanned receipt for the $5,000 property tax bill I paid on their house when my father had a cash flow problem. The string of emails from Evelyn, gently but firmly reminding me of Danielle's college tuition payment, which I had covered for 2 semesters. The wire transfer confirmations for the tens of thousands of dollars I had loaned my father to cover his bad investments. Loans that were never spoken of again, let alone repaid. I organized it all. I created a spreadsheet, a meticulous, damning ledger of their dependency on me. Every dollar was accounted for, with dates, descriptions, and corresponding documentation. The total was staggering. It was far more than I had realized. I wasn't just supporting Danielle's lifestyle. I was propping up my father's entire facade of success. The man who sat in judgment of me, who called me ungrateful, was standing on a platform I had built for him without his ever acknowledging it. This process was emotionally draining. Some nights I would just sit on the floor of my home office, surrounded by paper ghosts of my past generosity, and weep. I cried for the daughter who had so desperately wanted her father's approval that she had allowed herself to be used. I cried for the family I wished I had, a family that celebrated and protected each other instead of exploiting one another. But with each tear, the cold resolve inside me hardened. My grief was fueling my strategy. While I was documenting the past, Ms. Albright was securing the future. We reviewed every corporate document, every contract, every bylaw of Artistry Link. We identified vulnerabilities and systematically eliminated them. The most important document, of course, was the bailout agreement my father had signed 2 years prior. We went over the clause on page 9 a dozen times. It was airtight. A masterpiece of legal protection that he had been too arrogant and desperate to read. "He will have no legal recourse, Madison," Ms. Albright assured me. "His signature is on it. The agreement is notarized and was executed under perfectly legal circumstances. He needed your help. You gave it, and this was your insurance. It is an entirely enforceable contract." The next step was gathering intelligence. I knew they were plotting something, but I didn't know what. I didn't have to hire a private investigator. I just had to listen. I started accepting their dinner invitations again, playing the part of the dutiful, slightly weary daughter. I would sit at their table, absorbing the subtle digs and passive-aggressive comments, all while my mind was a recording device. I paid attention to the little things. A stray piece of mail on the hall table from a corporate law firm I didn't recognize. My father mentioning a meeting with his advisors, Danielle bragging about how she would redecorate the office once she started taking a more hands-on role at Artistry Link. They were so confident in my passivity, so sure of my eventual submission that they became careless. They spoke in veiled terms around me, but their meaning was crystal clear. They were planning a coup, and they assumed I was too weak or too stupid to see it coming. Each veiled comment, each smug look, was another piece of evidence, another brick in the wall I was building around myself and my company. I had moments of doubt. I would lie awake at night, my heart aching, and wonder if I was being too cold, too calculating. Was this who I wanted to become? A woman who prepared for war with her own family? But then I would remember Danielle's voice on the phone, demanding I pay for her clutch. I would remember my father's dismissive tone when I tried to talk about my own struggles. I would remember Evelyn's saccharine voice telling me to be a good sister and give Danielle what she wanted. And I knew this wasn't a choice between being kind and being cruel. It was a choice between survival and submission. I was choosing survival. The final piece of my preparation was the black folder itself. Ms. Albright and I assembled it with the precision of surgeons. It contained a clean marked copy of the bailout agreement. Behind it were the notarized documents solidifying my control. And behind that, a summary of the financial ledger I had created. A clear, concise accounting of every dollar they had taken from me over the years. It was a portfolio of their hypocrisy. The day before the family strategy dinner, I sat in my apartment and looked at the completed folder. It felt heavy in my hands, not just with the weight of the paper, but with the weight of my decision. I was about to detonate a bomb in the middle of my family. There was no going back. A profound sadness washed over me. A final mourning for the family I would now lose for good. But as I placed the folder in my bag, the sadness was replaced by a quiet, steady strength. My silence had been my shield. My preparation was now my sword. I was ready. The clatter of my father's fork on the marble floor was the starting pistol. The stunned, suffocating silence it left behind lasted for only a moment before the room erupted into chaos. The carefully constructed facade of their ambush shattered into a million pieces, and their true selves, panicked, grasping, and furious, were laid bare. Danielle was the first to find her voice. Her face, which had been pale with shock, flushed a blotchy, angry red. She shot up from her chair, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "What is this? What did you do?" she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You're a manipulator. You tricked him. Dad, she tricked you." "Sit down, Danielle," I said, my voice still unnervingly calm. The contrast between her hysteria and my composure seemed to infuriate her even more. Evelyn, recovering her senses, took a different, more threatening tack. Her mask of serene superiority was gone, replaced by a venomous sneer. "This is absurd," she hissed, her eyes like chips of ice. "This piece of paper means nothing. A contract signed under duress. We will challenge this in court. You will not get away with trying to steal from this family, Madison." "Steal?" I repeated the word, letting it hang in the air. A small, humorless laugh escaped my lips. "That's a very interesting choice of words, Evelyn." My father, who had been frozen, finally moved. He slammed his fist down on the mahogany table. The crystal glasses jumped. The silverware rattled. It was a familiar gesture of intimidation, a display of patriarchal rage that had always worked to silence me in the past. But this time it was hollow. The fear in his eyes betrayed the weakness of the gesture. "How dare you?" he roared, his voice cracking. "After everything I've given you, you pull a stunt like this? You use my moment of weakness against me? Your moment of weakness?" I met his furious gaze without flinching. "You mean the moment I saved you? The moment I wrote a check that kept this very house from being foreclosed on? The moment I kept your name from being dragged through the mud of bankruptcy court?" I stood up slowly, my own chair sliding back with a soft scrape. I was done being a seated target. I was now in command of the room. I reached into my bag again and pulled out another set of documents. Not a single folder this time, but a thick stack of papers, held together with a binder clip. I dropped them onto the center of the table. They landed with a heavy, definitive thud. "You want to talk about stealing, Evelyn? You want to talk about what you've been given, Dad? Let's talk." I gestured to the stack of papers. "This is a copy of the receipt for the $20,000 roof repair on this house that I paid for 3 years ago. This," I tapped another document, "is the tuition bill for Danielle's final year of college, which I covered when you said your investments were down. And this is the statement for the platinum credit card you all use for family expenses. A card that is in my name and is paid every month out of my company's revenue," I went on, my voice clear and steady, a merciless metronome ticking off their debts. I named every loan, every bill, every emergency I had funded. I laid out the cost of Danielle's car, her rent for the first year after college, the European vacation she took that I had paid for under the guise of a graduation gift demanded by our father. I detailed the thousands of dollars my father had borrowed, to cover his golf club memberships and bad stock market bets. With each new revelation, the color drained further from their faces. Danielle had sunk back into her chair, her mouth agape, looking from me to her father as if seeing the truth of their lives for the first time. Evelyn's threats had died in her throat. She just stared at the mountain of evidence on the table, her expression one of utter disbelief. This wasn't something they could spin or deny. This was cold, hard proof. My father tried to interrupt, sputtering about family contributions and gifts, but his words had no conviction. He was deflated, a punctured balloon of arrogance. I saved the most powerful blow for last. I looked directly at my father, my voice softening slightly, not with pity, but with a final, cutting clarity. "You want to take 40% of my company to ensure Danielle has a secure future," I said quietly. "But the truth is, for the last 5 years, you haven't had a company to give. You have had me. I have been your security. I have been your stability." I paused, letting the weight of those words sink into the poisoned air of the room. I then delivered the final line, the one I had rehearsed in my mind for months. "Without me," I said, my eyes sweeping over all 3 of them, over the expensive china, the crystal chandelier, the very walls around us, this house, this life you pretend to have, wouldn't even exist. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of total annihilation. There were no more arguments, no more threats. There was only the stark, ugly truth laid bare on their polished dining room table. Danielle was crying now, silent, shocked tears rolling down her cheeks. Evelyn looked like she had aged 10 years in 10 minutes, her face a crumpled mask of defeat. My father simply stared at the pile of documents, his hands trembling. A broken man who had just been forced to see the true foundation of his kingdom was not his own strength, but his daughter's sacrifice. I didn't need to say another word. My revenge wasn't loud or explosive. It was quiet, factual, and devastating. I had held up a mirror to them, and they had shattered at the sight of their own reflection. I picked up my bag. I didn't storm out. I didn't slam the door. I simply turned and walked away, leaving them alone in the beautiful cold room with the wreckage of their own making. The greatest justice was not in destroying them, but in simply showing them the truth and walking away, finally, completely, free. I walked out of that house and into the cool night air. Each step down the stone pathway to my car felt lighter than the last. The oppressive weight that had been settled on my shoulders for my entire life was beginning to lift. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The image of their shattered faces was burned into my memory, a permanent testament to my liberation. The drive home was surreal. The city lights blurred past my windows, a kaleidoscope of colors that seemed brighter, sharper than before. It was as if a filter had been removed from my eyes. I was running on a strange cocktail of adrenaline, grief, and a profound, bone-deep relief. The adrenaline was from the confrontation, the sheer terror and exhilaration of finally standing up for myself. The grief was for the final, irreversible death of the idea of family, the fantasy I had clung to for far too long. But the relief, that was the most powerful feeling of all. It was the relief of a prisoner who has just been set free after a lifetime of confinement. I expected my phone to start ringing immediately, but it remained silent for the entire 30-minute drive. The quiet was almost more unnerving than the anticipated storm. It gave me time to think, to process the magnitude of what had just happened. I had not just refused their demand. I had dismantled their entire reality. The power dynamic that had governed our family for 3 decades had been irrevocably shattered. They weren't just angry or defeated. They were in shock, trying to comprehend a world that no longer operated by their rules. I had just walked into my apartment and slipped off my shoes when the first call came. It was Danielle. I stared at her name on the screen, my heart beginning to pound again. I let it go to voicemail. A second later, a text message appeared. Then another and another. "How could you do that to Dad? You've ruined everything. Everything. Evelyn says her lawyers are going to destroy you for this. You're a monster, Madison. A cold, calculating monster." I read the messages, and for the first time they had no power over me. Her words were just the frantic flailings of someone who had just lost their lifelong safety net. Her anger wasn't really about me being a monster. It was about her terror at the realization that her free ride was over. I didn't reply. Next, a call from a number I didn't recognize. I answered cautiously. It was one of my aunts, my father's sister. Her voice was a mixture of confusion and concern. "Madison? Your father just called me. He was incoherent. Something about you trying to take over his business?" He sounded terrible. "Is everything all right?" The smear campaign had already begun. Of course. Their first instinct was not to reflect, but to control the narrative, to paint me as the villain. "Everything is fine, Aunt Carol," I said calmly. "Dad is just upset about a business disagreement we had. It's all a bit of a misunderstanding." I wasn't going to fight their war on their terms, scrambling to defend myself to every relative. My truth would come out in my own time, on my own terms. Then came the call I was dreading most. My father. I watched his name flash on the screen. My hand hovered over the phone, my thumb trembling slightly. A part of me, the wounded child that still lived deep inside, wanted to answer. But I knew what I would hear. Rage, threats, maybe even some pathetic, manipulative pleading. None of it would be an apology. None of it would be an acknowledgement of the truth. It would all be aimed at pulling me back into the drama, back under his control. I silenced the call and let it go to voicemail. A minute later, the notification popped up. A new message. I took a deep breath and played it. His voice was gravelly, a ragged sound torn between fury and desperation. "Madison, you think you're so clever. You think you've won. You have no idea what you've just done. You have destroyed this family. Destroyed it. Evelyn is talking to her lawyers. You will hear from them. You ungrateful child." His voice broke on the last word, not with sadness, but with the impotent rage of a king who had just been dethroned. The message ended abruptly. There was no remorse, no glimmer of understanding, only the shock of a man who could not comprehend his own downfall. He, Evelyn, Danielle, they were all trapped in the wreckage, pointing fingers at the person who had escaped the crash, blaming me for a collision they themselves had caused. They were in shock, not because I had been cruel, but because I had refused to continue playing my assigned role in their tragedy. I saved the voicemail. It was a reminder of why I had to do what I did, a reminder of what I was walking away from. The rest of the night was quiet. I made myself a cup of tea and sat by my window, looking out at the sprawling city. I felt a profound sense of peace settle over me. The shock was theirs, not mine. My shock had happened over a lifetime of small betrayals. Tonight was not a shock. It was a release. They had finally realized that the obedient daughter, the silent provider, was gone. They had realized for the first time that I was the one holding every single card. And their terror at that realization was the sound of my freedom. I turned my phone off, and for the first time in as long as I could remember, I slept through the entire night. The weeks following that dinner were a masterclass in my family's desperation. Their shock curdled into a frantic, clumsy campaign to regain control, not through legal means. As Ms. Albright had predicted, their lawyers quickly informed them they had no case, but through social and emotional warfare. The smear campaign began in earnest. My Aunt Carol's call was just the first drop in a flood of outreach from concerned relatives and old family friends. The story my father and Evelyn were peddling was a work of fiction, casting me as a cold, opportunistic corporate raider who had taken advantage of her own father's generosity to steal the family business. They conveniently omitted the fact that my father's business was long gone and that Artistry Link was entirely my own creation. They painted a picture of a loving family torn apart by a greedy, ungrateful daughter. For a few days, it was difficult. The calls were relentless. Some were sympathetic to my father's version of events, scolding me for my supposed cruelty. Others were simply fishing for gossip. At first, I tried to explain, but I quickly realized that engaging in their drama was a losing battle. So I changed my strategy. When a relative would call, I would listen patiently to their second-hand account of my villainy. Then I would say, calmly and without emotion, "That's a very interesting story. I have a rather different set of documents that tell a different tale. If you'd like to see the proof of who has been supporting whom for the past several years, you are welcome to make an appointment with my lawyer." No one ever took me up on the offer. The mention of lawyers and proof was enough to silence the gossip. It was a language they understood, not the language of emotion, but of consequence. While they were busy with their phone calls and whispers, I was moving forward. I had a meeting with my executive team and key investors. I was transparent. I told them there was a family dispute over ownership, that it was a hostile situation, but that I had it entirely under control with incontrovertible legal standing. I didn't share the humiliating details, only the professional facts. Instead of being spooked, my investors were impressed. One of them, a shrewd older woman named Margaret who had been an early supporter, looked at me across the boardroom table and smiled. "Good for you," she said. "Any leader who can't protect their own interests can't be trusted to protect ours. Our confidence in you has just doubled." That meeting was a turning point. It was a validation that came from the world I had built, not the one I was born into. It solidified my resolve. I was a CEO, a leader, and I would act like one. I had a PR firm draft a short, concise statement for any business publications that might catch wind of the rumors. It simply stated that Artistry Link's ownership structure was secure, and that I, Madison Carter, maintained full and sole operational control. It was professional, boring, and utterly effective. It gave the story no oxygen. My final act of untangling was to address the house that was a symbol of their power and my oppression. The house that I had in large part been paying for. I had Ms. Albright send them a formal letter. It was not emotional. It was a business proposal. The letter stated that I, as the primary lien holder on the property due to the outstanding personal loans made to my father, was giving them two options. They could either buy me out for the full amount documented, or we could proceed with a formal sale of the house, from which my investment would be recouped. The fallout from that letter was immediate and explosive, but it was the explosion of a dying star. They didn't have the money to buy me out. Their bluff had been called, and their kingdom was built on a foundation of my money. After weeks of furious, unanswered phone calls and threatening letters from lawyers they couldn't afford, they conceded. The house was put on the market. I never spoke to them directly through any of it. All communication was handled through our lawyers. I cut off the credit card. I blocked their numbers. I erected a wall of professional silence around myself, a wall they could not penetrate with their guilt, their rage, or their demands. 6 months after that final dinner, the house sold. The funds were wired to my account, every last dollar they owed me. Around the same time, I heard through the family grapevine that Danielle had moved into a small apartment and had, for the first time in her life, gotten a real job. My father and Evelyn had downsized to a condo, their lavish lifestyle a thing of the past. I found my own peace, not in their downfall, but in my freedom. I bought a new apartment in a part of the city they would never think to visit. It was smaller than their old house, but it was mine. Every piece of furniture, every book on the shelf, was a testament to my own life, my own choices. I started a small garden on my balcony. I adopted a dog from a local shelter. I began to build a life filled with quiet joys, free from the constant dread of the next demand, the next confrontation. I built a new family, a chosen one. My friends, my employees, my investors, they were my community. They were people who respected me for my mind and my work, not for my wallet. My life became my own. One evening, I was watering my plants on the balcony, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. My phone buzzed with an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something made me answer. It was my father. His voice was small, thin, a ghost of its former booming authority. He said he was sorry. He said he missed me. He asked if we could talk. I listened, and for a moment, the little girl inside me wanted to believe him. But the woman I had become knew better. "I'm glad you called," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "But I can't. I wish you well, Dad. Goodbye." I hung up the phone. There were no tears. There was no anger. There was just a quiet, profound peace. I hadn't just protected my company. I had reclaimed my life. And I had learned that sometimes the only way to truly find your home is to walk away from the one you were born into. If you've ever been told to sacrifice your dreams for someone else's entitlement, this story is for you. I didn't just protect my company. I protected myself. Like this video if you believe in standing up to manipulation, subscribe for more stories, and drop your thoughts in the comments below.